Hi, I'm Michelle. I like to read all kinds of books, but I especially love to read stories. Stories give me the opportunity to walk around in someone else's shoes for a while and to learn life lessons through his or her experiences. This year, I am reading 52 books. In my videos posted each Sunday, I will give you the skinny on each one. I have to be honest. This is not the video that I was hoping to make this week. I guess feeling like our nation has just been pummeled with one disaster after another, I was looking for words of insight from those who survived, those who lived to tell about what many people consider the worst disaster that our country has ever faced, and that's the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. I, this week, read The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan, and I've got to say, it was horrific. It was not pleasant to read, but I kept thinking, how did these people survive this? How did they live through it? What can they teach us about resilience? Very often when we read about the Dust Bowl, we hear about the people that migrated out of there, who left that area, but actually about 2/3 of the people who lived there ended up staying. They stuck it out. They lived through it and lived with it. When you read this book, you read about people like Ike Osteen. He said he lived during the flu epidemic of 1918. He lived through the worst depression that our country had ever seen. He lived through the war that tore our globe apart, and yet the dusters of the 30s were worse than anything that he had ever imagined. He said it was a time when just breathing, the most natural thing in the world, was dangerous. It was a threat. You read about people like Jean Clark, who was just a little girl when these dusters came through. She talks about playing outside in her yard when the worst one of all that we've heard about is Black Sunday came through, and she said all of a sudden it was like I was in a whirlpool and everything was just black. I couldn't see anything. You read about the people who, like the measures that people took to try to survive. And despite that, many people contracted this dust pneumonia and many people died. One of the doctors in the book said, really, people are just dying because they are full of dirt. They've just breathed it in and it is all still inside of them. And it wasn't just the people, their livestock, their cattle, their pigs would die because they were just full of dirt. And in a time when you want to cling to the people that you love, you want to hug people, you want to be able to shake hands and smile, you couldn't touch anyone because the air was so filled with static electricity that even just touching somebody would send a shock through you that was just way too painful. So people lived in these crowded little homes and just tried not to touch each other at all during this time. The first part of the book talks about how these people came to live in the Great Plains, how their families ended up there. It talks about how they came to be in this situation. How did the earth happen to rebel so terribly during this time? As you read, you come to know these people, and their stories are just so heartbreaking. And you come to love these people, and you're cheering for them. You want them to make it. You want to see better days for them. And again, I asked myself, how did they do it? How did they find the strength to keep going? Well, the answer is pretty simple, but it's not easy. And that is simply that they had to live just one day at a time. In a way, it's like you're living in two times at the same time. You have to think about the future, and you're thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to make a better future? But mostly it was just doing what you have to do right now, taking the next step. So that might look like saying, I've got to sweep this dust pile out of my house, or I need to hang up sheets to cover up the windows, wet sheets, because there may be another dust storm later today, because they came every single day just about. So they were just realizing it's what to do right now. They found meaning in serving other people, realizing, okay, at least we're all in this together. There were teachers who agreed to teach school, even though they weren't getting paid, but to continue to educate children. There were, one of the doctors in the story that we read, he said, his thing, he found his meaning in service and serving other people. He said, he opened up a soup kitchen that served beans and hot coffee. And he said, in the end, he said, my goals have come down to two things. One is just to survive the dusters, and the other is to keep the soup kitchen open. And then there was just the sheer tenacity or stubbornness or whatever you want to call it, the idea that this is not going to get the best of us. We are going to survive. And always there was just the hope that the worst days were behind them, that it had to get better. Things were going to get better. The Worst Hard Time was a very well-written book. It was a good book. It actually won the National Book Award, but yet it was very heavy and not easy to read. So I am very glad I read it. You decide for yourself if the time is right, because sometimes timing is everything. Decide if this is when I want to read it. My heart goes out to the victims of the disasters that we're experiencing today, the people who've been through the hurricanes and the flooding and the fires now out in California. And I just want you to know that I am so sorry. In this book, there were people who believed that and preached that the dusters of that time were God's punishment. It was because of the abuse that had been done to the land, and certainly that was a consequence of what was happening at the time. And yet I feel more like Hazel. She was a lady in the book who said, she was religious. She said, but that is not my God. My God is not a vengeful God. God is a God of hope. And so if you are walking through a terrible time now, I just want to say that, God is holding on to you. You're not walking through it alone, and God has not turned his back on you. He is walking through it with you. And I hope that you will lean into him and let him carry you through this. And again, my prayers are with you right now. If you want to read more about the Dust Bowl, a really good book was The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. I really do like Kristen Hanna, but this book, The Four Winds, is probably my favorite. It's, of course, fiction, but it is historical fiction. It talks about that time. And then, of course, there is John Steinbeck's classic, The Grapes of Wrath. I read that in high school, and I liked it okay, but as an adult, I really liked it. Again, sometimes it is about timing. As for me, I am tired. I think that this week I'm going to read something a little lighter and a little shorter. So I hope you will join me next Sunday, and I will let you know what it is that I read and what I learned from it. Thank you for watching.